Right, so we're going to start the 1790s. There are 4 topics for this decade. You're only supposed to write about half a page per decade, so don't include too many notes for the 1790s. It's the second largest one of the half century. But we're just going to go over the London Corrosponding Society, the Naval Mutinies, the popular Loyalist campaign and its battle against the United Irishmen United Societies, and Thomas Payne's Rights of Man. So the LCS was founded by Thomas Hardy in 1792. It was theoretically open to all of the classes as the subscription was only 1 penny a week. This is far cheaper than the going rate of 24 pennies a week for most of the popular societies at the time. I suppose you could draw a correlation there between William Cobbett's 2 penny Trash, which was the weekly journal he wrote, so that would have been available to the working class. So membership was roughly 1,000 people. On its average. Thomas Hardy did claim it went up to 5,000 at its peak, but most historians disagree with this consensus and they believe he had inflated the figures. It's far more likely that the median membership of the LCS was only 1,000 members at a given time, and it was primarily composed of middle-class tradesmen. So this can be parallel to the fact that it was supposed to be open to all, because obviously if it's mainly the middle class, it's not really unifying both middle and working class supporters, which would be really needed for any kind of force that could put a decent amount of pressure on Parliament. So obviously the LCS failed to entice the working class. It was limited in the sense that it was primarily located in urban areas, so I think in the boroughs, in the large towns, large cities. So membership didn't really permeate into the countryside and the counties, which is significant when you consider the fact that counties were safe seats to the Tory party. So they're not really going to have that same kind of power because they can't really put pressure on the Tories because they have no members in their local seats. So little extra parliamentary pressure put on the Tories by these societies. It was the largest radical society of its time, and they were largely moderate despite claims that they were intensely radical, because obviously they wished to significantly distance themselves from Thomas Payne and his ideas of republicanism that we will get onto later. So the piece of propaganda I've included to the left, I believe that was by Punch, and it's essentially part of the popular Loyalist campaign, depicting the London Corrosponding Society as essentially a load of troglodytes, saying that they were just stupid, ugly. It's the same kind of propaganda they were using against the Jacobins at the time. Obviously, this wasn't the case. If you need evidence of the moderate nature of the LCS, I've included pictures of the petitions that they'd been drawing up and the coins that they had established for their members. Because you have to remember, it was hard to get messages around when the printing press was still fairly new, so it's kind of hard to get your message out there. It's why the suffragettes in the 1900s, they did stuff like mark votes for women on 2 penny coins and just handed them out to people. It's just a way of getting your message out. And it says United for a Reform of Parliament. So you can see by that they're inherently reformers. They're not radical Jacobins like is commonly believed. So the aims of the LCS, They wanted universal manhood suffrage, bearing in mind that at the time women could still theoretically vote, as they were not officially disenfranchised until 1832 with the Great Reform Act. But that's an entirely different story that we'll go on to some other time. They demanded annual elections, redistribution of seats, and the abolition of the rotten boroughs, so for example Old Sarum. They did not wish for the monarch to abdicate their role as the head of state. Obviously, people like Thomas Payne and the Jacobins, Robespierre, Jean-Paul Marat, they detested the idea of monarchy. Even some very liberal philosophers like Voltaire were staunchly against the monarchy, but they wanted to keep it, so that kind of makes you think, were the LCS that radical? You could argue it if you have the information for it in your essay, but I'd probably say they were not. They're kind of more of the Burkean gradual reform over time kind of reformer. So they sought to achieve change peacefully. Revolution was not on the table for the London Corrosponding Society. So, bear in mind, London Corrosponding Society in operation between 1792 and 1799, when they were banished by William Pitt the Younger's reign of terror and his acts such as the Seditious Practices Act, which essentially put them out of business. So the Naval Mutinies of 1797. These took place at Spithead and the Nore, and they were a major blow to a government at war with France. Because obviously you have to think, the military is supposed to be the most loyal institution in a society, and if they are going to be essentially rebelling from the government, it kind of puts the legitimacy of that government into question. So the historian E.P. Thompson argues that they were of Jacobin instigation, with the mutineers being revolutionaries. Now, this is contrary to the popular consensus that the mutineers were essentially rebelling due to poor living conditions on the ships, but that is to be expected considering that E.P. Thompson is a Marxist, so he kind of believes in the idea of class consciousness and the historical dialectic, very Hegelian. It's a lot to explain. Most historians disagree with Thompson's consensus and believe they were instigated in response to the appalling conditions faced by sailors at the time. The sailors petitioned Parliament for better conditions and professed their loyalty to the Crown. Following this, the mutineers were granted their demands, and once their demands were granted, they immediately returned to service. So the history itself seems to contradict E.P. Thompson's view. So if you're going to be including this in the essay, talking about how the government dealt with it, you could say the government dealt with the naval mutinies very well, as they immediately met the demands of the mutineers and quelled the situation. But if you're going to go, oh, they didn't handle it very well, perhaps you could talk about the roots causing it if you believe in E.P. Thompson's view. Remember, you can have any opinion you like, providing you can back it up with evidence. So now we're going to move on to the United Irishmen and United Societies. These were the Society of United Irishmen were radicals. They aimed to unite Protestants and Catholics to gain an independent Irish Republic. So you're going to have to remember, this has nothing to do with Daniel O'Connell and the Catholic Association yet. This is before their time. So they attempted to establish a military that would receive aid from France, essentially to instigate Irish uprising to forcibly devolve the nation. The societies failed due to both internal divisions and conflict amongst loyalist organisations like the Protestant Orange Order. The United Irishmen wanted united societies on the mainland to revolt simultaneously as a means to essentially give them better chances of the revolution happening. They did not communicate with the radical underground until Pitt's reign of terror, which obviously pushed many of the radical societies underground. And obviously this would have severe repercussions in the future, and I would highly recommend this as a bridge between decades, talking about how the government's repression of these societies and Pitt's reign of terror ultimately resulted in the members of these societies moving to the radical underground, where they became more and more radical, and in the future they would partake in plots such as the Despard plot of 1802, where many of the plotters were members of the LCS, and they likely would not have engaged in such a treasonous practice were the LCS and other moderate societies not taken out of the mainstream. They were easily infiltrated by spies, the leaders were arrested, and the movement was crippled. It is doubtful that they ever had a chance of success. So if you're going to be talking about the government succeeding in repressing the popular protests of the time, or what did the government respond effectively? Yes, it did, because the agent provocateurs, the spies within, and the government legislation ultimately destroyed any chance that these United Irishmen and United Societies had to instigate a revolution. So now we're going to go on to Thomas Payne. I've included the diagram there. That's not Thomas Payne, that's William Cobbett. But it's just a famous picture of him returning from America, having visited with the bones of Thomas Payne. So Payne immigrated to America in 1774 and worked as a journalist. He published Common Sense in 1776, which would prove to be one of the main texts used by American colonists, and it's perceived to be one of the inspiring works of literature of the early colonial period, and it kind of encapsulated the ambience of the time. Obviously, you can see similar ideas to those Payne was talking about in his Common Sense, espoused by the founding fathers of America. So, Payne wrote Volume 1 of The Rights of Man in 1792. So remember, this is the French Revolution is happening at the moment. The reign of terror under Robespierre has not happened yet. 1792 is fairly moderate, so yeah. Then he writes Volume 2 in 1793, and this is the extremely radical version, where he essentially proposes some of the more left-wing aspects of classical liberalism, such as a minor welfare state, just to really help the poor. He talks a lot about this in his book. Parallels to history, the policies he advocates are pretty much those employed by the Liberal government in the early 1900s in Britain. So, his book, The Rights of Man, was a response to Edmund Burke's reflections on the revolution in France. Burke initially supported it, but eventually grew to detest it. Payne's writings were Republican and classically liberal. The radical societies wanted nothing to do with Payne. Obviously, they would get heavily censored if they were the kind of Paynian radicals of the day. By 1793, 200,000 copies of rights of man had been sold, which is a very remarkable figure for the time. In September of 1792, this is the beginning of Pitt's Reign of Terror, Payne was charged with treason, so he fled to France. Ultimately, he moved back to America, because remember, he'd emigrated back in 1774, and he would die there, and that's why I've included this picture of William Cobbett returning to England with the bones of Thomas Payne for the 1810s, the most turbulent period of the time. That'll be probably your largest paragraph in your essay of the 1780s to 1820s. So just bear that in mind. They may not all be of similar size. I'll have to remember to include the Black Lamp conspiracy at some point as well. So I believe that's it. We'll be going over the 1800s next lesson. I don't believe there's much for that. So that'll be about 3 events: the Despard plot, the food riots, and the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars. So, very exciting.